Broadcasting from our New England studio, Solutions Review is proud to showcase Revenera in the Solution Spotlight, an inside look at enterprise technologies.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome to the Solution Spotlight featuring Revenera, and focused on how to manage open source risk in M&A. When it comes to transactions, including mergers and acquisitions, open source related issues are sometimes overlooked, often not well understood, and almost always addressed much later than they should be. So today, we've assembled a team of experts to help explain the critical issues, provide ways to mitigate risk, whether you're sell side or buy side, and break down why being proactive is critical. And to walk us through this presentation today, we have Venkat Ramdonga, Director of Product Management at Revenera, Leon Schwartz, Principal at the GTC Law Group, and Russ Ealing, Founder and CEO of OSS Consultants. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Hey, Doug. Great being here.
Well, I'm glad you're here. There's a lot to cover. This is a fascinating topic, and I think it's a great one to really dig in on, and we've got a pretty interesting panel. So Russ, I'm going to hand it over to you now. I know you're going to take the lead and then bring in all the other panelists as we move forward. But when you're all wrapping up, I'll jump back in and we'll do a little Q&A at the end.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate that. So hi, everyone. I'm Russ, founder of OSS Consultants. We're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes manage their use of open source software. We help organizations with everything from scanning and audit services to building an entire open source governance program. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors and had responsibility for designing and implementing a successful open source governance program at GM, which was among the first of its kind back in 2013. As the compliance officer, I built the governance program responsible for reviewing software in every part used in every GM vehicle anywhere in the world. So today, myself and the rest of the team at OSS Consultants offer our recognized industry-leading expertise to help companies of all sizes scan, audit, and report on their software, as well as helping them to create efficient open source governance programs. Follow us on LinkedIn, where several times per week we post tips, industry news, and practical guidance on how you can better manage your use of open source.
Thanks, Russ. So hi, guys. I'm Leon. I am a principal at GTC Law, like Doug said. And what we do is we focus on many facets of intellectual property, including very complex M&A and other transactions. We've also been involved with open source related diligence since long before it became cool to say that you are. So over the last 15 years, I've guided companies large and small through their transactions. I've helped folks understand both the benefits and the risks of using open source software. And we've put together practical, actionable policies and processes that allow them to reduce those risks. And of course, in the course of doing this, I have seen thousands of code scan reports. Prior to that, I was a software developer for almost a decade, which means that I completely understand why many developers tend to dislike most lawyers. And I try very hard not to be one of those lawyers that is disliked by developers. We'll see how successful I am.
Hey. Thanks, Leon. Hello, everyone. My name is Venkat Ramdonga, and I'm responsible for the product strategy for Revenera SCA business. And I've been in this role for over 10 years now, and we have built a robust solution around software composition analysis, which specializes in both automated SBOM creation and also deep dive analysis of how we can understand and uncover open source risk coming from open source software. So with that, I would move on to Russ.
Great, thanks, Leon and Venkat. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So in the next 45 minutes or so, we'll go over a high-level intro of what open source software is. We'll talk about some of the common risks around using open source. Leon will discuss what open source means in the M&A context. And then Venkat and myself will offer some practical approaches to managing open source risk. And following that, Leon will get into some of the finer points in M&A transactions. And then we'll conclude with some Q&A. So with that, let's jump right in, and we will start with some Open Source 101. So if you're joining us live or you're watching the replay, you're already likely aware that open source speeds up time to market, drives innovations, and revolutionizes the technology world. In fact, a recent Harvard study estimates that open source software provides $8.8 trillion of value for companies globally. So there's many definitions of open source depending on who you ask. Despite the variations, most people would define it as free software that's subject to a license that makes the source code freely available to inspect, modify, and share. So use of open source requires you to comply with the terms of the license. But just because you find software on the internet doesn't mean you can use it. In fact, many times there's no license, which means you don't have permission to use that software. So with that basic introduction, let's get into some of the different license types. Leon, over to you.
Yep. Hey, thanks, Russ. One other thing I do want to mention on that previous slide is people tend to forget things like data, specifications, interfaces, such as APIs, right? Because they don't think of them as code, but they very much fall under the same sort of idea of if you don't have a license for it, then you can't really use it. So that's something to keep in mind. Now on to this. So if you've been to an open source presentation before, you've likely seen a graphic like this. The thing that we want to make sure is that people understand that open source licensing is not a monolith. It's just like commercial licensing, differs from agreement to agreement. Some are extremely permissive. So you see them on the left-hand side of the screen there. Some are more restrictive, and some you simply can't use in your commercial ventures. Despite there being thousands of licenses out there, you don't have to be qualified to write one. I've written one. We typically see the same sort of 20 to 25 of them that cover the components that most developers want to use, which means that when we are writing our policies and when we're developing our processes, we don't have to worry about the thousands of licenses. We have to worry about those 20 to 25. And we can leave room to review other licenses as they come in, as they become necessary. So with that, let's talk a little bit about open source risks, right? So there are tons of benefits of using and relying on open source software. If there weren't, we wouldn't have much of an audience today. And even though we can't see you, we are assured you're there. But with the benefits, there are also some risks, many of which are similar, of course, to the risks you see with commercial licenses. I don't want to make this seem like it's all doomsday here, but some are a little bit different. So bottom line, right, you can see all the risks on the screen here, but the bottom line is if you use open source software incorrectly, you could be in breach of your contract with the open source developer. Well, that's a lot like a breach of contract with your commercial software developer, right? You could find yourself accused of copyright infringement. So again, sort of similar to commercial software. But you could also end up having your entire work be considered a derivative work of the open source component, forcing you to then either release the source code to your entire program that uses the open source part, or you pay a heavy price not to the original developer for a commercial license. Now, over the years, one thing that I found is that smaller companies often struggle with finding the time and, of course, let's be honest, the money to set up their policies and their processes early enough, right? So they sort of kick the can down the road until they raise money, or they wait for an event, right? For some sort of a transaction to happen where somebody's doing diligence and then this is all going to be done on somebody else's dime. So never a really great idea because it doesn't really take very much time or cost very much money to put a policy in place. So a simple policy is, a couple of $1,000s. And because in the long run, you end up spending a lot more, right? The cost to remediate something, and Russ, I'm sure you'll have something to say about this in a minute, is a lot bigger once you've used it for a while than it is when you're deciding which component to use if your policy says, hey, you can't use this one in this way. The other sort of aspect of this that we're seeing recently is the open source world has really grown up. And so the risk of enforcement that you're seeing, the litigation that we're seeing, is more by commercial entities. You're much more likely to have a vendor demand that you pay for the commercial version of their component that you've been using under an open source license than you are to have the SFC come in and demand that you release your source code for the good of humanity, right? And this, of course, is just licensing risk, right? There are additional risks associated with transactions. We'll talk about those in a minute, but also, obviously, many security risks and other issues that should be addressed as well. Right, Russ?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, proper management of open source isn't only about license management. It also has to do with security. But this is true for all software, not just software that's subject to an M&A transaction. So the reality is that neither open source nor proprietary software is always more or less secure. No software is perfect, so you could find vulnerabilities in just about any software project. So we'll go into more depth on inventory in an upcoming slide, but at a high level, having an accurate inventory of your open source at least gives you additional insight into some of these potential risks or the risk exposure to security vulnerabilities that can be discovered in open source. As Leon mentioned, there are licenses that they have requirements to potentially distribute source code, some of which could be proprietary, as well as licenses that might require you to provide information required to update the device. So those could all be some kind of security risk as well that should be considered. Regarding remediation, this is the risk that you incur when you need to remediate or fix your open source. So this could be upgrading your open source packages due to a security vulnerability or potentially swapping out a package due to undesirable licensing. But whatever your reason for remediating your software, inevitably, as Leon mentioned, it's going to cost time and money to some degree, regardless of whether or not it's part of an M&A transaction.
Right. So why do we care about open source in the M&A context? It's a good question, right? In the context of transactions, the risks get a lot higher. So you could literally be buying a lawsuit. A vendor that is both an open source and a commercial version of their software may choose not to enforce or go after a startup using the open source version incorrectly because there's no money to recover. There's no reason to spin up the machine. But once the startup raises enough money or once it gets bought by a huge multinational, all of a sudden the calculus changes. The pockets just got a lot deeper, right? So all of a sudden you could be hit with, oh, by the way, for the last 10 years, you've been using this component and now we want 10 years worth of fees and also something extra, right? Transactions also often change business models, right? So something that used to be just a pure SaaS solution, which is one risk profile, may now become something that's available as a private cloud where you distribute it to your customers who stand it up on their site. It could be fully an on-prem solution, right? Which changes things. Even the deal itself can be impacted by open source. So open source can change the build versus buy calculus for acquirers, right? Would it be better for us to just build it ourselves then? If there's so much bad use of open source software in here, it can change the valuation, right? You're paying for something here. Is it worth paying for or should it be free? It can delay signing and closing, right? And that's back to Russ's point, right? When there's remediation to be done and you didn't know about it ahead of time, now you're finding out that it has to be done before the deal closes. That can delay all of the things here. Also, in a transaction, you sometimes lose the developers who are best able to answer the questions after the transaction closes, right? They don't travel with the code necessarily. So that's key. And what's key for buyers is to perform diligence to find out just what it is that they're buying. And the key for sellers is to be prepared for this diligence, which basically means that they should just review their own code ahead of time, right? So how do we do that? And that's the review process. It's actually a lot simpler than people think. What you start with is a list of third-party components. And we're primarily focusing on open source here, obviously, in this conversation, but really commercial components should be reviewed too. So it's all third-party components. A good list is sourced from multiple sources. Developers will self-report things that they know they're using. You can augment that with package managers, manifest files, right, for dependencies that the developers might miss. And then a software composition analysis, an SCA code scan, which I'm sure Venkat will tell us about in a little bit, can be used to find the things that neither the manifest nor the developers have listed. And it can be used to find things like code snippets, right? Those things that somebody found on the internet for which there are no licenses, and which, as Russ mentioned earlier, we can't use. And then what you do is you analyze the components, the licenses, and the particular use. Is the component distributed? Is it hosted? Is it linked? Is it modified? Those are the four main ones that you typically see people asking questions about. And then you see if any changes need to be made for remediation purposes. At the end of the review process, you end up with remediation actions, right? Things you have to fix, whether it's legal remediation, where you need to go out and get a license, whether it's code remediation, you need to remove something or replace it, then you end up with a complete notice and attribution file, which you need for compliance, right? To give the customers a list of all the third-party components you're using. And you end up with software bills of material, SBOMs. And again, we'll cover those in a little bit. And because you've gone from unknown risk to known analyzed risk, it means that in the context of a transaction, the parties can now negotiate who just owns that risk. So what makes a diligence review process successful? The key is prioritization. Whether you're looking at your own code or whether you're buy side in an acquisition, there are ways to make sure you get most for your money, right? When there are multiple code bases of products, starting with the most important ones first makes sense, right? Especially on what we call deal timing, right? When everything has to be done very, very quickly. When reviewing components, it's important to collect only enough information to help you decide whether the use of a given component is acceptable, right? If you're asking your developers or the target's developers in an acquisition for usage information for permissively licensed components, ask yourself why, right? Why does it matter if they distribute MIT licensed software? And if you can't come up with a good reason why you're asking the question, then don't ask the question. You're wasting your time, you're wasting the developer's time, you're not getting anything useful back. There are other shortcuts too. If you know that a particular application or a particular code base is only used internally, you don't have to ask the developers if any of the components you found in the code scan are distributed, right? If the whole application is internal, then everything is internal. So, and next, I think we should probably talk about best practices.
So let's drill down a little bit to see what this means at a practical level. And before I get into each item, it's important to understand that all of the best practice items that I'll discuss here aren't exclusively applicable to M&A and due diligence. They'll go a long way to helping with what's required in diligence, but these are all just simply good practices for managing open source. So I'll start with policies here. As Leon mentioned, you need to provide your open source policies for review and diligence. Most organizations, if they have an open source policy, have made them unique to their specific goals, their beliefs, their cultures, their strategies. And as such, this should be the overarching guide for governing use of open source within an organization. Typically, a policy should be a statement of expectation regarding the use of open source, should be communicated or at least available to most parts of the organization that are involved with software development. My preference is to have a minimalist policy. So the ones we draft at OSS Consultants are typically 1.5 pages to 2 pages, though we've certainly seen several that are more pages than anyone will ever read. For processes, processes important to empower your organization to balance the business benefits with the right amount of risk management. Without a good process for use of open source, you don't have any rules or control over what actually gets used and then what to do when it doesn't align with what your organization allows. So hence the importance of being reviewed as part of diligence. You also don't want your process to be burdensome. Less is more as long as it's efficient. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to get people to follow it, and then even more difficult to prove that you're following it during diligence. Lists of third-party software. So software that comes from third parties you might buy under a commercial agreement will generally also require disclosure and diligence. Typically, commercial software is received in a compiled or executable format, so there isn't much you can do on your own from a scanning perspective to identify the extent of software used. One way to overcome this is to require your third-party suppliers and OEMs to disclose their use of open source. It may even reveal usage of open source with non-permissive licensing, which, as Leon mentioned, can be a factor in diligence. A common and more standardized approach to disclosing open source and other softwares by using or requiring an SBOM, which stands for Software Bill of Materials. The concept of an SBOM started gaining traction with the US Cyber Executive Order that came out in 2021. So we won't go too deep here, But an SBOM, for those who are unfamiliar, it's like a list of components. Some would liken that to software ingredients, so such as metadata and authors and versions. It's essentially a summary of the pieces of code that make up your applications and services. So we won't go too deep into this again, but they could be an entirely separate webinar, even an entire webinar series. But please feel free to reach out afterwards if you have any questions. I can direct you to additional resources as well. For notice and attribution compliance, our aim should be full compliance with all open source license obligations, like the ones Leon described earlier. However onerous the obligations of a license may be, we should always make sure that we're at least complying with the obligations that are really not up for debate, like providing notices and attributions and copies of license terms. This can often take effort to compile and assemble these notices and licenses, but there are tools as well as professional services that can help you with this. And I'm sure Leon would agree that having these available on Diligence is a definite plus, whereas not having them is not going to be a plus.
That's an understatement, but yeah, absolutely. So it's very important that, as Russ is making very clear here, it's very important for sellers or potential sellers, right? Don't think of yourself as a seller yet, to go and do this review, right? The more of this you do ahead of time, the quicker and easier the transaction is going to be. Right. It's awesome when on the buy side, you show up and you start asking your diligence questions and immediately you start getting responses. Here's a copy of the policy. Here's a copy of all of our SBOMs. Here are all of our notice and attribution files. Here's the reason why we approved these restrictive licenses, these copyleft licenses. It makes it all go much, much smoother.
Definitely. And I mean, it also respects the broader open source community. Someone somewhere has made the software available. They've specified a set of requirements in the license that let you use that software free of cost, or maybe free of payment might be the better term. The least you can do, or at least you should do, is respect that. And I guess finally, there are laws in place if you don't comply. For contributions to open source, this is what happens when your developers contribute software projects, feature enhancements, or even bug fixes to software that might be under an open source license. Most developers are likely doing this anyway, so it's better to at least have a formalized process. There's lots of considerations for why this is important. For this webinar, perhaps the biggest consideration is the potential impact to IP for any contributor agreements that may have been agreed to when the code was contributed, which will ultimately be under review as part of Diligence. So managing contributions to open source often comes down to well-defined process and good documentation. Okay, so let's talk about inventory, or the importance of having an inventory, and how each of the points on the slide relates to inventory. So as we've mentioned already, knowing what software you're using is key, not just in Diligence, but as a best practice. Also important to note where that software is used, so in which products and to which customers. Maybe how the software was used, perhaps as a standalone library, which might be important to know from a license compliance perspective. You might want to know when it was used, so in which releases and in which months and years, because you may need to upgrade to a version of software at some point. So basically, without an inventory, you don't know what you have or what you may not have. You might also not know where something was used or how it was used. For SBOM, we covered this a little bit already, but good to bring up here again. As SBOMs become easier to put together, it becomes easier once you understand, which open source components make up your software. Assembling them just becomes that much easier once you have the inventory. And then aside from being a best practice, it'll also help tremendously in Diligence. Notices, I think we already covered, but we talked about why it's important to have these. But more from a practical or technical perspective, it's good to associate each required notice file to each software component, keeping in mind that a single component may have several licenses. So it's not always one-to-one mapping. In fact, most often it's not one-to-one mapping. For license compliance, you want to update your inventory if and when new license information is available. So this often happens when new versions of packages are released, but most people aren't proactive about checking for this. For security, you want to continuously monitor your inventory for vulnerabilities. To keep things in perspective, there are no silver bullets. Security and license compliance evolves and changes with time, like over time. So as one example, when a developer first uses an open source component, it's less likely to contain known vulnerabilities or CVEs that might be associated with it. So what normally happens is that vulnerabilities are discovered over time after security researchers investigate a particular open source component and version. So having SCA or software composition analysis tooling as part of your development process allows you to identify and catalog the open source you're using so that when a new vulnerability is published, you can quickly identify if you have any exposure. For strategy, you want to understand your risks and how you might approach reducing some of that risk over time. For example, your software inventory allows you to look at the bigger picture scenario. You may be able to see that you have more problematic open source vulnerabilities or licenses in use than your legal department would like to see. And that it may take a longer period of time to remediate rather than to assume it can be accomplished as part of a 2-week development sprint. So with an inventory, it'll give you better insights in order to help you plan better.
You mean not everything in the world can be accomplished during a 2-week sprint? No way.
Shockingly, no. For risk posture, you want to look at this several ways, but having an inventory helps you understand your risk posture. For example, abandoned open source projects that could become security issues since they're not likely actively being maintained. Similarly, you could look at outdated components or packages as they may be unlikely to receive security patches in the future. There's certainly potential risk for risk with licensing. You could have a lot of copyleft obligations that you're meeting, but perhaps the responsibility is with the single person in your department or the one that came from the old company in the M&A transaction. And if they leave or are no longer there, there might not be anybody potentially to help manage that. So with that, let's switch gears a little bit here. We'll switch over to Venkat. You can talk a little bit about the importance of deep scanning and file level evidence and how that helps you understand your inventory.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. I think Russ talked about some of the best practices that we should probably adopting, for managing open source. However, if you look at in 2025, none of this process can purely be manual, right? So we would need the right tooling to ensure that the due diligence for uncovering the risk, by using open source software is complemented by a good tool set. Now, modern day, SCA tools or the composition analysis tools, focus on, just SBOM creation, right? And, hey, give me a list of components, that I'm currently using. Give me a list of components that's, exposing the risk, right? Now, which is a good practice. I think Russ and Leon talked about, the importance of SBOM, in, conventional SCA practices. But, if you add the context of, an M&A, opportunity or an M&A, exercise, the due diligence requires more than just automated discovery and producing an SBOM. So if you recall a couple of slides earlier, both Leon and Russ were talking about how SBOM is only a part of a larger picture, talking about illustrating all the components used in the source code, but it is not just the only game here, right? So, the importance of, deep scanning and file level evidences when conducting a due diligence, is really paramount. Because, there are two types of, issues that come out of, due diligence when you're doing an M&A exercise is, embedded license snippets, in the code, as the first part, so what happens is, people just go ahead and copy a piece of code, from internet. Could be some Stack Overflow, could be maybe from Copilot or somewhere else. And then just for the sake of giving an attribution to the original author, they go ahead and declare a small segment of a license snippet just on top of the method they're using. Now, in most modern day SCA tools, they would fail to actually identify this particular snippet, which would be a very key attribute in defining the open source component, right? We talked about the importance of identifying the right licenses. We talked about identifying the risks, coming out of not identifying the right licenses. So what happens is, it is very critical to reveal the, in code declarations, okay, that confirm the inclusion of an open source library, right? And then, they will have to validate this compliance with the license terms, whether it's a license that is permissive or, non-permissive. Categorize them accordingly in your SBOM. If you're constructing an SBOM, okay, during the due diligence, go ahead and, categorize it accordingly. And just as Russ mentioned, we, open source licensing is never one-on-one, right? So there could be a component that is in use, there could be a file in use, okay, which is largely attributed to and permissive open source license, but I as a developer would have modified the source code during my static linking and made changes and included a method which is probably GPL licensed, right? So these are certain risks, okay, that you would run into if you do not have or pick a tool that doesn't support deep scanning, okay, while doing an M&A due diligence. And the second aspect of it, okay, is how Russ talked about the importance of having notices, right? So, and when you're writing a proper notices text or a notices statement, okay, it's also important to give attribution to the original open source author, right? And more often than not, you'll actually find a lot of copyright statements, okay, available in the source code, available in pom.xmls, available in README files and whatnot, okay, which give us two hints, which help us in two ways. So one, arriving at the open source component based on a copyright statement that could help an open source analyst to find out which component this is being referred to. And second, also giving attribution to the original author. Okay, I love the fact of attribution in the open source world, because it is respectful to say, hey, this is not my piece of code, I'm actually inheriting this from somebody else, and I'm thankful for that. So these two aspects are really important when doing a due diligence, and picking the right SCA tool, okay, which can actually have these capabilities complement your due diligence strategy, okay, is really important, okay, and not just rely on a command line SCA tool that can just produce an SBOM.
Yeah, and Venkat, you're not kidding. This idea of giving credit is so ingrained in developers' minds. Many years ago, a former roommate of mine in college copied my code to submit as his own, and then decided to attribute me in the submission for the professor. And I'm glad I caught him before that happened, so we didn't have to answer all sorts of interesting questions. But yeah, he was like, but I got the idea from you. And I'm like, the problem is you didn't get the idea from me, you got the code from me. So this very much just percolates all the way through. So yeah, so you're absolutely right. Like we tend to see this all the time, right? And it's important for the tooling to bring it to your attention, right? Otherwise, there's just thousands of lines of code, millions of lines of code.
Yeah, it's simply not possible for us to manually scrape for those and find out which snippet of the piece of code, okay, has a notices segment, which piece of the which snippet of the code, okay, has a copyright statement, which piece has a license fragment. If you think about the GPL license, Leon, so there is a large license, okay, and then there is a license summary, right, and which is just 2 sentences. So it's really important that we capture these, okay, during the scanning process and file level evidences, okay, to finish the due diligence.
Exactly.
Right. So I'll I'll hand off to Russ again to continue on other best practices for managing open source.
All right. Thanks, Venkat. So we talked a lot about how there are all these different ways to better understand and manage the technical aspect of open source. So let's tie it all together a bit and get into some of the governance structures and frameworks for managing open source more holistically. So one such construct is an OSPO. If you're not familiar, an OSPO is short for Open Source Program Office. This is the governance structure that supports and enables 2 primary functions, consumption of and contribution to open source. So usually an OSPO is an organization structure within an organization. Sometimes it's a formal organization, sometimes a little more informal. Most often, an OSPO becomes the place where open source is understood and supported beyond the technical construct from what might be viewed as a purely software development perspective. So at a high level, OSPOs establish and maintain formal policies for your company's approach to open source. They can set development guidelines around use of open source. OSPOs often oversee license compliance, which may include running scans or reviewing scans. This should hopefully involve some kind of governance, especially when the reviews have produced results that are inconsistent with the company policies. So even more broadly than license compliance, the OSPO can often produce essential documentation that we've already talked about, such as the notice reports, security reports, SBOMs that we discussed earlier. And if you're part of a supply chain, this can include identifying any upstream security or licensing risks that might eventually make its way to you and your organization. So we don't have time to get further into OSPOs, but feel free to reach out afterwards if you have any questions, or if you just want to stay informed about OSPOs. Similar to SBOMs, we post OSPO topics quite often on LinkedIn. So give us a follow, and you'll see those topics in your feed. So another construct for managing open source, or even as a framework for setting up your OSPO, is OpenChain, specifically ISO 5230. So we won't go too deep into this, so I'll just touch on it briefly. This is a project from the Linux Foundation. They maintain the ISO 5230 standard, which defines the key requirements of what a quality open source license compliance program should look like. For those that are more focused on managing consumption of open source, meeting the ISO 5230 requirements often gets you most of the way to having a functioning OSPO, which, as we've learned, is not just a good best practice, but can also help set you up by being prepared for any due diligence activities. So OpenChain focuses more on what elements an open source program should contain and less on the how. How the requirements are implemented and met is up to each individual company, and certainly help is available if you need it. So OSS Consultants is an official partner of OpenChain. We've helped a number of companies with various stages of attaining conformance to ISO 5230, including BlackBerry, which was the first whole entity conformance with an official OpenChain partner. The Linux Foundation published a nice, concise case study about how we help BlackBerry attain conformance to ISO 5230. We published a blog article on our site at the link below, and also have the link to download the PDF directly there as well. While you're there checking out the case study, you can also have a look at some of the OSPO and SBOM and other open source resources we provide as well. Okay, let's get back to some of the specifics of M&A. Leon, talk to us about the transactions.
And I'm going to try to keep us moving, just because I do want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. And I prefer to do this, by the way, live, so that the questions come right at us. But we'll take what we can get, and hope that nobody's asleep yet. So we've talked a lot about diligence, and there's a good reason for that, right? Because that's a large part of open source sort of compliance efforts in general, and of course, a large part of transactions as well. But there are other things that we should talk about too, such as the actual agreement between the parties and how open source issues will crop up in there. Before we do, we keep talking about M&A, but there are lots of different transactions that this would apply to. So this is just some of them on the slide here. So you've done your diligence, you're negotiating the agreement. What should go in the agreements? We start with representations and warranties, reps. So these are going to be IP, intellectual property reps, which typically are fundamental reps, which means that they are less likely to be capped in your recovery. There are other obvious things about fundamental reps that makes them more important. First is a scheduling rep. What is a scheduling rep? It's a rep that requires a true and complete list of all third-party software components with relevant usage information for each component. Does that sound familiar? It better. We just spent, the better part of a half an hour talking about it. It's exactly what you get at the end of diligence, right? In a transaction setting, the buyer wants to know that what the seller has been telling them during diligence about their components, about the use, is actually true, which is not surprising. The seller, knowing that a rep like this is coming, and if you're a seller or a potential seller and you don't think it is, it will be. You need to be careful and thorough when you're answering your diligence requests. As long as at the end of the day, this rep in the agreement tracks the diligence that was completed, it's likely fair for both sides. Now, one thing to keep in mind as a seller, sometimes sellers don't push back on diligence requests that are overbroad or otherwise unfair because they're thinking, you know what, this diligence process is a pain. The quicker I can get through it, the quicker I can get back to developing software and getting paid and selling my company. But again, knowing that at the end of the day, you are going to rep to all of the things that you said during diligence, the time to push back is when you get an overbroad diligence request. So again, knowing that the rep is coming just keeps everybody honest during diligence. Oftentimes what we see is when diligence hasn't been performed, right, or it hasn't been performed very well, the sellers will try to slide things like knowledge qualifiers in here, such as to the seller's knowledge, the list of third-party software is true and complete. That doesn't really work in most cases, right? Of the two sides, the sellers are the ones that have the access to the code. They're the ones who made the decisions about what to use. And the buyers often have absolutely no way of knowing what's in there before the transaction closes. So of course, a way to mitigate this is with a good quality SCA scan. So talk to Venkat about that. In addition to knowledge qualifiers, another concept that lawyers really love is materiality. No one wants to be in breach of a rep over some foot fault somewhere. The problem with open source, though, is it's really hard to determine what is and isn't material when it comes to having a complete list of open source components. Forgetting to list an AGPL licensed piece of code is probably worse than forgetting to list an MIT licensed one. But because both still require notice and attribution, if you didn't list it, chances are it's not in your notice file, which chances are you're not in compliance with your notice obligations. So does that make it material? Not material? So in most cases, it's probably more fair to leave materiality out, and the materiality will just come into play naturally as damages, right? You may be in breach of the rep because you didn't disclose an MIT licensed component, but if it got fixed and new notices have been provided and nobody's making claims, nobody's asking for money, then there's no damage. There's nothing to recover. So this is something you will almost always see. It's a form of what we call a substantive rep, or colloquially, the no bad open source rep, right? There are many, many, many flavors of these out there. Many have been cobbled together over time, starting from a very well-worn template and then sort of glommed onto it. What matters is these things here, right? Your use of open source isn't in such a way that requires a disclosure of your IP, of the company's IP, requires allowing others to modify or create derivative works of your code. Now, if you want to do that, fine, but it shouldn't require you to. This allows prohibitions on reverse engineering to the degree that that's possible. So some places it's not. Or makes it impossible to charge money for companies' products. Now, you may also want to prevent unintended IP grants, such as patent licenses that you weren't anticipating. Now, if you're the seller, be careful of overbroad non-infringement reps. So read the language carefully. If you're being asked to represent and warrant that the third-party components you're using do not infringe anyone's IP, ask yourself how you would know if the original author of an indirect dependency you're using infringe someone's patent rights. If you don't know, or if you can't know, the rep essentially becomes free insurance that you're providing to the buyer, right? You can't tell, they can't tell, but you're insuring them in case there's damage there. Some other things to think about, right? People often go really word happy in their definitions of open source software, especially lawyers who struggle to define it. If your definition has a list of licenses, it's probably not very good because, as we talked about earlier, there are thousands of them. Why would you just list some of them? Sometimes people like to reference the OSI in their list of licenses. Also not great. They don't approve licenses that are duplicative. They don't approve anything that doesn't fit their definition of open source. So nothing that prohibits commercial use, for example. Some people say, well, licenses similar to those approved by the OSI, but to be honest with you, I have no idea what similar would mean in that context. Knowledge qualifiers can work here, right, depending on deal dynamics, leverage, and industry, right? It might be acceptable for the seller to say that to their knowledge, there is no bad OSS use. Not often, but sometimes that happens. Knowledge qualifiers do work sometimes. The concept of reasonableness, which is sort of the legal equivalent of catnip, we sprinkle it everywhere, is generally not, right? Simply too hard to determine what's going to be reasonable and what's not in the context of OSS licenses. Materiality does work here. So you'll see the overbroad catch-all that we have on the slide here, right? Every license will impose some limitation, some restriction, or some condition on the right or ability of the company to do things, right? To use the software. So if you put the word material in there, that becomes a lot more palatable. So, and then of course, consider whether it's fair to shift some of the risk here from the seller to the buyer via disclosures against this rep. A rep that no recent audits have been performed by third parties, right? More for commercial use, really. But it lets the buyer know if there are companies that are sniffing around and there are potential claims coming later. A rep that all code has been provided to the code scan provider chosen to perform the scan, just to make sure that nothing accidentally, or perhaps less than accidentally, is left off when code is uploaded for scanning. A rep that the seller is in material compliance with all licenses. Why material? Same reason as before, right? There's a chance that they're not in complete compliance with their notice attributions. Most people are not. A remediation covenant, right? So the seller, if they're going to perform remediation that came out of diligence, if it's happening between sign and close, right? You have a covenant that covers it. This can be a closing condition, but as the buyer, have a list of things you will close regardless whether they've been remediated or not, because as Russ pointed out earlier, we can't rely on things being remediated within 2 weeks, sometimes not even within 2 months. So it's important to do all of this earlier if you can. If any diligence is postponed past signing, then a covenant to continue to engage to provide responses makes sense. Otherwise, sellers get awfully quiet between signing and closing. And if there are any consents that need to be obtained, again, usually with commercial agreements, not so much with open source. That's another one that we see. And then finally, we get to the money. So in addition to breach of rep claims, if something goes wrong, buyers want to be indemnified. And here, right, again, keeping an eye on the clock, the most important thing here is that the better prepared you are as the seller, the farther away you can get away from the general indemnity. It says anything related to open source, I want to be indemnified for. And really, if you run a tight ship, if you have a policy, you have a process, you can show that not only do you have a policy and a process, but you followed the policy and you have followed the process and you have all the results. You can say, look, use of open source is not a zero risk game. You can't get the zero risk. I'm not willing to take a general indemnity against all open source use. No one has sued me. I know what's in my code. I've shown you what's in my code. The risk going forward is on you, not on me. Now, if there are specific issues, right? Let's say you were using an open source component from a particularly litigious author who also has a commercial version, and the use is sort of, let's call it borderline. Yeah, that's a good place for a specific indemnity that says if this particular author comes after us, the seller is going to have to pay for it, and they pay for it out of escrow, right? So that's the money that's held back. And goes there. I think the only thing I'll say about escrow is if escrow is used to pay for post-closing remediation, which does happen sometimes, I like to make sure that both the buyer and the seller have to pay some of the remediation costs. And the reason for that is, well, there are two. One is because buyers will think twice about what needs to be remediated, absolutely needs to be remediated, if they have to pay for some of it. And two, sellers have no control over what remediation actions will be taken after closing, right? At that point, the buyer owns the company, so they can't control costs. So it's a little more fair, I think, to have both pay for some. Should it be an equal split? No, not necessarily. So with that, Kat, I will hand back to you.
Thanks, Leon. And as conclusion, I think we'll keep talking about some of the capabilities on how Revenera SCA solutions can actually help. I think Leon and Russ covered quite a bit on the theory and practices on how to actually overcome the risk by including OSS software. But as we talked about it earlier, it has to be complemented with the right tool set, the right tooling, giving you all kinds of insights that are dug deep into the core, for you to uncover all of these risks. So, how do we help, and what's our history is, I think we're probably, 17, 18 years into what we're doing, as a core SCA business. And some of these that you see here, starting from a comprehensive SBOM management, which is the need of the hour as well. We specialize in ensuring that any source code thrown at us, any binaries that are thrown at us, we'll be able to analyze them in a very accurate fashion and produce an SBOM that adheres to all the industry standard, okay, which is either SPDX or SecondDX, and to the latest specification versions as well, right? So this is really important, for modern day SCA, and also, for any M&A due diligence. And this SBOM management, will all fall flat if you do not have a vast collection of open source components. So over the years, we have built a hefty collection of open source components and their metadata, which include like the component versions, descriptions, version licenses, version license history. Okay, which probably Leon has a once an interesting story to tell us about on how certain components licensing change over versions. And all of this collection is really important, for you to understand the license positioning of a particular component version. We keep thinking that, vulnerabilities are an attribute of a component version and not a component, which is true. But then you'll be so surprised to figure that even the licensing of a component, okay, is more often than not, okay, is tied to the version in which when it was released, and not just to the core component. Like for example, a foobar 1.0 could be licensed under Apache 2.0, but then the latest foobar can actually be licensed under GPL, right? Because I decided that I will not provide this as an Apache 2.2 licensed software. So all of this collection is where we really shine in ensuring that both M&A due diligence teams and security teams and OSPO teams, okay, have access to a proper SCA solutioning that helps them stay on top of open source risks, which are either coming from compliance, license compliance, or security exposure. And we talked about a lot of license compliance. One of them about which again ties back to the collection of open source components. But we also have good specialization in compiling third-party notices, right? So third-party notices is a little tricky. I think Leon touched base on that in a bit before. The third-party notice, okay, should actually include the text of the notice that the open source author has originally declared when they have released the software. So, as conventional wisdom says, I found an open source software, I just go to the license, pick up, the notices text from the latest version, and then put it in my notices text. No, it's not. So the true as declared license is available only in the version release of the software. So, and I'm happy to share that, we also have, our ongoing jobs which collect these, license tests in their, true format, okay, which help with end-to-end compliance management in compiling the third-party notices text. And a little bit of how we do this. So we talked about, scanning for copyrights. We're not just about, scanning manifest files like pom.xmls or, package.jsons, but we go file by file within readmes, within notices text, within source code to understand the copyright statement, so that you can compile your attributions document, you can compile your third-party notices text in the most accurate way possible. And sometimes these copyright statements also help you, lead to the right open source component as well. And the next item, I think we talked about deep scanning a little bit, but here is a small screenshot of what we do. Okay, when we say we do deep scanning, right. So this section that you're talking about, looking at on the screen here, okay, which is highlighted in green, okay, is a license snippet. Okay, it's not the complete license, okay, mind you, but it is a license snippet, okay, that somebody has as a good citizen using open source software has decided to include it, okay, in the header of the source file that they're finding. Here is where Revenera's code insight shines, right? So it doesn't just identify that there is an open source component, but at a file level, it helps you highlight that segment of code that helps you in identifying, hey, there is a license segment here, okay, which can help me arrive at the right open source component. All right. So with that, thanks a lot everyone for joining today. And here is the contact information for Leon and Russ. Thanks a lot, Leon and Russ, joining me here. You done?
Well, very good presentation. There was a lot covered there, and we don't have too much time left. But I have a couple of questions that I As a technology nerd here at Solutions Review, I'm curious about the idea of automation and deep scanning. And Venkat, can you just go over? I know you talked about how you do the deep scanning, but how do you keep the data sets or the code sets up to date so that you're kind of constantly able to verify the latest open source code?
So as I said, I think our history helps here. Like we are very early to the party. Okay, this business dates back. We don't know the exact date, but we've been in this business for over 17, 18 years, and it helped us compile a lot of data. Okay, and maturity in our processes, our engineering processes as well. Okay, help us stay up to date with what is covered and what is covered, what is being collected from where, right? So we have a huge collection of open source components, over 15 million of those, and we frequently update our customer instances, okay, with these open source components. There is two sets of items here that we need to ensure that the customers are updated with. One is, hey, do I have a new open source component available? Do I have a new version of an existing component? Is there a change in the version license mapping? Okay, that's important as well. And more importantly, hey, how often do I actually update or refresh the vulnerabilities? Because vulnerabilities cannot really stand for more than a day. So we refresh all of this data on a daily basis to ensure that our customers are up to date on the latest vulnerabilities.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask the question before we wrap up with regard to the future of code generation and the implications that are right now highly liquid with regard to generative AI generating code, beginning to operate almost autonomously, and there's a strong sentiment that a lot of human coding is going to begin to go away. What are the implications? I mean, from a legal perspective, as well as just a technical perspective, with regard to artificially intelligent code being created based upon it ingesting open source elements? I mean, where does this end, or how does this stay up to date?
Doug, do we have another hour or
Yeah,
maybe
no,
6 to discuss?
I had to get this one out. I had to. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the way to sandbag it at the end. Yeah, no, we're happy to come back and do an entire
Maybe that's
hour
it.
or 2 or 6 on it. But the short end of it is, of course, that is a big issue, right? Because time and time again, it's been shown that regardless of the settings that you put in place in your GAI tools, they can absolutely spit out code that's an exact copy of what they were trained on. And as Doug pointed out, what were they trained on? Well, they were trained on open source projects, some of which have licensing, which is great, and some of which have licensing, which is less great for commercial use, right? So what you need to do is figure out how to put guardrails in place, how to put policies in place, but most importantly, what you do with the code that the tools output. And the answer there, I think, at the very least, is code scanning. They can pick up snippets, right? Because if they can pick up snippets of code, it should be able to at least give you some level of clarity into what's there. But yeah, it's big topic, obviously.
Yeah, no, and I would love to have everybody come back and talk about that. We are in a wild era, and it's only going to get more interesting, and it has implications across all kinds of aspects of life, including certainly software creation, but also the legal issues and open source. So I'm going to leave it at that. This was great. We would encourage everybody to check out Revenera's website for all the deep scanning and code scanning that can go on and reach out. We also have the contact information for both Leon and Russ. That is, if you have any questions regarding specifically open source issues and legal issues. But gentlemen, thanks very much for the time today. Appreciate it, and best of luck sorting through all these interesting issues going forward.
Oh, it's fun, and please do reach out. Right, we're not very fun at parties, but we do like to answer open source questions in our spare time. So thanks, Doug. Thanks to Revenera as well for letting us join.
Yep. Thanks, Doug. Thanks Venkat and Revenera.
So there you have it, another solution in our spotlight. We want to thank Revenera, Venkat, Leon, and Russ for that presentation, and we appreciate your attendance as well. Till next time, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review. Thanks for watching.
If your business would like to be featured in a future event, contact us today.